Quite an experience to live in fear, isn't it? That's what it is to be a slave.
If you're a recurring viewer of this channel, it shouldn't surprise you that I'm a total sucker for world building. Overused analysis lingo aside, games are really the closest the medium has ever gotten to allow you to not just be an observer of a world but also an active part of it. And to some degree, I imagine it's like you watched a movie or read a comic book or anything and told yourself, man, I wish I could live in the possibilities that world provides. After all, stories and experiences are bred through imagination. They tell the desires, thoughts, opinions, and fantasies of their respective creators. Within that realm, few creators ever expose such highly intense passion for the vision, such as Hideo Kojima. Kojima is a game director I've already mentioned once on this channel before, as back in my Killer 7 video I drew a comparison between him and Suda51. I still stick by that comparison pretty strongly for a large majority of reasons, and one of those is how much they're both creators that are highly inspired by the Western pop culture medium that is removed from their own native culture. In the case of Hideo Kojima, this should be no surprise. He's gone on record admitting that his biggest inspiration is movies, and that he originally wanted to be a film director, and anyone who's played or watched a cutscene from Metal Gear Solid series can probably easily deduce how much he lets that influence seep into the games he makes. Even as early as the initial games on the MSX, this was one director who had no qualms in imbuing intense amounts of dialogue and lengthy story into his games, something I'd say was surprisingly ahead of his time considering this was the early 8-bit era, where stories in games were not yet considered as important as they are today. With the Metal Gear Solid series, as technology evolved, Kojima got increasingly motivated to turn his games perpetually cinematic in each subsequent entry, and since the games were the most successful that his employers had going for them, he was continuously encouraged to keep making those games and was allowed some of the most unprecedented level of creative freedom that AAA games today would quiver to even think about bestowing. Metal Gear Solid 2 explored an unprecedented meta-narrative, Metal Gear Solid 3 was a campy spy epic, Metal Gear Solid 4 had over 7 hours worth of game time and cutscenes, and Metal Gear Solid 5, while far less story-heavy, embraced a more movie-based cinematography style. Now, Metal Gear is a series that has gone on for quite some time, and that's actually allowed it a lot of leeway and time to become its own highly distinct, unique series that managed to transcend most of everything that was inspiring it. Things like Kyle Reese being used for the cover or certain other actor likenesses, references, and tropes are diminished a lot more in subsequent games to allow for something that was less explicitly derivative. But in building that scale and almost exclusively being committed to doing the Metal Gear series alone, it's easy to forget a time when the franchise maintenance wasn't necessarily the most important thing in the back of Kojima's mind. A starry-eyed time of naivete and where he let his inspirations shine through more overtly. It's during that time when he ended up releasing a gem of a game where those inspirations shine more brightly than much of anything else he's made. Snatcher is quite the oddity of a game. Initially, the game was released a year after the very first Metal Gear on MSX computers, and while it's credited mainly as a Kojima game, the producers and director roles throughout the project have varied heavily between versions. And therein lies the crux of the issue. Snatcher has as many as 6 different versions. However, in spite of the variances, the story, design, and planning has consistently been Kojima's work. The original versions on PC-88 and MSX2 released in 1988. However, that iteration of the game is unfinished, as Kojima's planned 6-act story had to be cut down to 2 acts, leaving a lacking resolution after what was meant to be the game's midpoint plot twist. 4 years later, the game got a PC Engine remake which included a third, now final act of the game, and was also the last version that Kojima had any real involvement in. This is the version where the game's now signature graphics, music, and voice acting stem from, but presumably due to abysmal sales of the PC Engine in the West, where it was known as TurboGrafx 16, the game was never localized. The Sega CD version that came out 2 years later, however, was an almost identical port and had quite a few additions to the game's opening, as well as its endgame. This version of the game was explicitly designed for the West in mind, and was the first time Snatcher made its way overseas. Alongside the likes of Sonic CD, Snatcher is usually considered to be one of the few best games on the system. Not enough to redeem it, but great enough that they are acknowledged as all-time classics. Finally, in 1996, the game got ported to the Sega Saturn and PlayStation, and these versions are generally considered gutted versions due to some questionable changes made to the game's graphics and sound. Out of all these versions, the Sega CD version, released 6 years after the initial release of Snatcher, is commonly considered to be the most popular and known one, which is kind of a tragedy when you think about what console it had to be on, with the game allegedly only selling a few thousand units. It was nonetheless a fantastically well-received game at its time, credited for being one of the first few games of its ilk to blend some rich usage of cinematic elements with an adventure game setup, and it's become a cult favorite. Good luck finding a physical version of the game, mind you, cause these asking prices are pretty insane. So what is Snatcher about? In a future setting of 2047, a time when the world had recovered from a deadly biohazard, a race of bioroids starts showing up in the fictional Neo-Kobe city, a small artificial island off the coast of Japan, which is described as something of a small country in its own right. The artificial life forms kill members of the population only to ultimately replace them and assimilate themselves into society. These bioroids eventually become to be known as Snatchers. The protagonist of the story is Gillian Seed, an amnesiac who, along with his wife, was discovered in cryostasis in Russia 3 years prior to the game's events. Becoming a military officer after reawakening, he accepts an offer to be recruited into the anti-Snatcher task force Junker. He accepts the offer as both him and his also amnesiac wife, whom he has a strained relationship with and is separated from, have a vague recurring memory of Snatchers, and he believes investigating them might hold a key to their lost memories. As a designated runner, his job is to investigate disturbances of Neo-Kobe City, to find and eliminate Snatchers, but more importantly, to locate the source of them and why they have begun appearing. Now, if this is your first time ever learning about Snatcher, it's quite possible that there's a glaring elephant in the room that begs mentioning, but, well, we'll get to that in a bit. Much like more recent franchises such as Ace Attorney, Snatcher is a hybrid game, blending adventure game elements with plenty of visual novel elements. You control Gillian through a text-based interface that allows you to observe, investigate, and move between key areas through specific text-based commands that the game gives you. Arguably, compared to many contemporaries, it's possible to see Snatcher as slightly archaic in this regard. Unlike this game's spiritual successor, Policenauts, it has less of a hands-on approach as it lacks a cursor, restricting interactivity. And much like Policenauts, it can occasionally have a stingy way of blocking progress, with several commands having to be selected multiple times to yield a response, a blurry line between the look and investigation commands, and also some early puzzles requiring frequent usage of the Junker HQ's database. Having said all that, this is more so a process of getting used to the game's mindset, and despite some associated initial tedium, I soon came to appreciate Snatcher's somewhat streamlined approach to investigation. It emulates the feeling of being a private eye or investigator really well, and finding the story check to progress is almost always a satisfying feeling. The second part to the gameplay is action shooter segments. In the process of investigating, you'll sometimes be thrust into combat sections where you're forced to battle Snatchers or Insectors. These take place in a 3x3 first-person grid where your aim needs to stay quick and true. Funnily enough, the difficulty of these is something the game scales accordingly based on your performance in the practice range early in the game. While I wouldn't say these offer any fundamentally riveting gameplay mechanics, they're still exciting experiences nonetheless, primarily because they're designed to make you not expect them when they show up. It makes the player often be on their toes while investigating, they don't show up so often as to not outstay their welcome, and it creates an exciting thrill of unpredictability. Some later encounters actually become somewhat of a nerve-wracking challenge, to be quite honest. But an adventure game of this particular kind is rarely held up by its gameplay alone. Snatcher was hailed as a fairly groundbreaking game for its time due to using cinematic visuals and cutscenes to tell its story, and the serviceable mechanics would not have nearly the identical level of effect were it not for the ancillary representational elements that drives us to explore them. I'm not going to be spoiling this game, but having said that, it's impossible to talk about the game's story without addressing the obvious elephant in the room in regards to the game's setting. Again, it's not a secret that Kojima is wholly influenced by movies, and he's infused his games with several references, iconography, and sometimes derivative elements to movies he really loves. But Snatcher, being one of his earliest games, has some definitive telltale signs of generous borrowed influence. A future setting, the building structures of Neo-Kobe, flying vehicles, villainous biodroids that assimilate themselves into the populace, a hard-boiled trenchcoat-wearing protagonist who's tasked to deal with them while not being fully aware of himself. His actual designation? Yeah, it's Blade Runner. There's no real way around avoiding that comparison, honestly. Kojima cited the movie as one of his absolute favorite movies of all time, and there's no doubt that Snatcher is a game where Kojima wanted to explicitly tell a story within the same framework. Right down to some generous lifting of many elements Blade Runner is iconic for, as well as some other movies in the process, to the extent that several new versions and localizations had to tone these elements down. Even so, Snatcher is a game that resonates in spite of being pretty much a video game take on Blade Runner, with a dose of Invasion of the Body Snatchers to go along with it, and it still manages to be unique all the same. This obviously isn't anything that shouldn't be expected, because I think no matter how much you can try copying something, it's inevitably going to end up different at some fundamental level, as the creator's own sensibilities will no doubt infer what it is that's being done. But I think part of the reason Snatcher succeeds so well in the elements where it is unique isn't just for being an engaging story in its own right, but precisely because it's kind of owed to the familiarity and dichotomy of things that Blade Runner, Terminator, and those other movies are known for. The ways in which Snatcher manages to deviate itself are executed in some subtle and coy ways, Many of them possibly not intended, but also a lot of them, again, owed to the very thing I talked about in both the Killer 7 and Beautiful Joe videos. Now the director's appreciation of a medium can be interpreted some interesting ways through their cultural barrier. If we'd have to compare the protagonists, I'd say Deckard and Gillian presentationally aren't all too removed from each other. They're both part of special task forces that need to eliminate a highly specific yet contentious threat, and they're both good at what they do. Gillian is admittedly far more vocal and sexual character than Deckard, but the former point is somewhat expected in this medium where inner monologue drives actions. And when it's also essentially a bit of a buddy cop adventure due to your tiny Metal Gear sidekick.
Metal, introduce yourself.
Yes, sir. Pleased to meet you, Gillian. I am Metal Gear Mach 2. I am programmed to be your personal assistant.
Metal Gear? That's a pretty weird name.
Holy shit. In any case, the protagonists are only slightly analogous, all things considered. Having said all that, I think it's after that where Snatcher ends up showing that in a certain way, it treasures its iconography just a little more so than Blade Runner tries to do. Here's the thing, Blade Runner was generally speaking not a movie that was particularly concerned with its own set dressing. Despite all the imagery that has been immortalized in the annals of cyberpunk culture, it's an incredibly subtle movie that doesn't really dwell much on the fact that it is a movie taking place in a retrofitted future. The fact that the movie has a dystopian element to it is something that's mainly inferred by the audience due to its grimy and grey environments, the fact that there's an instant conflict that it generally always has its lens zeroed in on very specific characters, the unpleasant totalitarian looking setting. I think in a modern Hollywood landscape, a newcomer to Blade Runner would possibly have assumed the movie to be a lot more action-filled than it is, when in reality it's a whole lot more subtle than you'd think. It's a psychological, character-driven story about the human preconceptions of artificial life, which is why the movie almost always stays ambiguous about itself, its protagonist, and the lore surrounding the world. In contrast, Snatcher could be argued to have an almost inverse mentality of the way it treats its world. Both Blade Runner and Snatcher start off with a quick exposition dump, but with Snatcher it immediately sets up the context for its world, and doesn't really try hiding the fact that, unlike replicants, Snatchers are an obvious threat to humanity and an undeniable antagonistic force. This makes the story of Snatcher fairly straightforward and less ambiguous compared to Blade Runner, and while there's still an overarching mystery to why the Snatchers exist, for the most of the part, it's in service of the wider world that the game wants to sell. This is the very thing, if I'd have to explain it, that separates the two titles, since Blade Runner wasn't so much concerned about its iconic looking world as it was about characters that just so happened to be in it. In stories, there's usually a distinction between those that can be defined as story-driven and those that can be defined as character-driven. While I think Snatcher falls squarely into the latter category, I'd also think it's fair to call it world-driven. Mainly because due to actions committed by characters, it's not so much events that get put into motion as much as it is discovering the elements to its universe that those characters are ultimately partaking in. Unlike Deckard, who's already settled into the world he's a part of, Gillian is practically a tourist of Neo Kobe City, just as much as the player is, and him being actively on the job ends up correlating into him learning about the city. And really, it's actually a pleasant city. The neon colors are rich, the townspeople are active, your coworkers feel like actual people. Gillian can spend one moment investigating a disturbance while in the next you'll be a socializing womanizer, or eating some of the city's signature culinary with Metal Gear. Wait, how does that even work?
Gillian, perhaps we should go.
My Neo Kobe pizza. It sank just like the rest of this city's gonna.
Let's get going, Gillian.
I can't believe that. I'll never waste my money on one of those stupid things again.
It's worth pointing out that the game often ends up becoming really intense real fast, and I love how it can reasonably balance that feeling with all those pleasant casual moments. It adds an all the more immersive feeling of being an investigator, and those moments of downtime end up being those that you occasionally treasure the most as a result. The tranquil moments become all the more relaxing, while the rare extreme cases of a grotesque imagery end up hitting harder because of how unexpected they are. This is a game that is great in exercising restraint, and knowing when to sweep the player off their feet with an unexpected encounter or discovery. By knowing when to throw the player into an urgent situation, it gives an increased level of appreciation to the moments when you're given a breather and some additional time to soak in the atmosphere. The writing of this game is really fantastic, and there's been an incredible level of dedication and work gone into its localization. The voice acting in particular is one of this game's best and most memorable elements.
It's a very narrow stairway. We'll have to go down single file.
Okay, who's going to take the point?
That's obvious. The guy with the light.
Hey, that's not fair.
The actors breathe so much life into these characters and are pretty much perfect for the roles they play. Gillian and Random Hajil are some incredible standouts, making for some of the straight up coolest characters you'll be spending time with. Metal Gear works wonderfully as an analytically meek sidekick, and the sidecast is just so memorable. It's hard not to walk away from the game loving the characters in here, and the voice acting in the game helps add on to all that personality. I'd almost call it some of my favorite voice acting in games, to be quite honest. One of the main reasons I also believe this world also ends up feeling so legitimate and honest is because of the occasional calls you have of Gillian's wife. This is a subplot I really love, mainly because the moments you spend with Jamie can act as a refreshing respite to the intense Snatcher hunting. Gillian and Jamie are separated, as despite having been married before the both of them lost their memories, Jamie fears that the rocky relationship they have as of present is one that the two of them held onto due to convenience. What I love about it is just how there are sincere glimpses into lives we can only infer, and it shows despite how Gillian is just as new to the environment as us, he also has a healthy dose of baggage. The game has a whole slew of flavor text and dialogue. Much of that flavored dialogue takes place in these conversations where Gillian attempts reconciling with Jamie, asking her out on a whole bunch of dates or just casually talking about their lives. It's some really precious, intimate moments, and having played the game in a somewhat tumultuous time in my life, I couldn't help but be drawn to it. In a game where it really wants to sell you on the legitimacy of its world above so much else, it's the moments like these that make life in Snatcher feel as human, casual, and enjoyable as any of us would expect. And it makes the life in Neo Kobe, a city which is already described as a wide melting pot of culture and people, come across as desirable had it not been for the Snatcher instance that is threatening the peace. It isn't even really until the final act when the game starts delving further into the actual history of its protagonist and placing a little more importance in character motivations. But by this time, it's something that the game fully earns due to how much time we spend experiencing the world of Snatcher, a world that is just as much of a draw as the journey. In spite of using so many elements from Blade Runner, it manages to adapt it into a very different kind of story, one that reasonably admires so much of its aesthetic choices and tells a lovely crafted story of its own within. For the lack of a better name here, I'd call it adaptive world building. It creates a world based on already defined elements we know, which makes it hard to call original, but the fact that it isn't becomes one of its main strengths in highlighting the very things that make it unique. It very much owes its existence to the movies that inspired it, and it feels unabashedly like them too. Being able to hold that distinction alongside its own qualities makes it all the more enjoyable, since it's completely honest in the elements that are derivative. It just overall ends up adding on to the charm of the title. Snatcher is a game I absolutely think is worth experiencing at least once, since it's hard to find as many games that have such a lovingly crafted and cool world that is easy to immerse yourself into. It's thrilling and occasionally very unnerving, but it's done so in the best kind of way, with subtle executions as to not have the lasting effect of it wear out. This makes it a great low-key experience to enjoy a quiet evening when you want something suspenseful but also relaxing. The first time I got to experience this game was with my good friend Dom, and we'd spend the night all the way till 3 in the morning playing it, being absorbed in a mystery, but also just enjoying how casual the game was about its entire world. It's experiences like those that are hard to replicate in life. Despite being a cult hit though, Snatcher is a game that looks destined to remain only such, with no additional ports or games being made after the 1996 Saturn and PlayStation versions. With Kojima being gone and Konami being Konami, it's kind of hard to see them bringing this franchise out of his grave, but ultimately I have to say I think that's fine. Snatcher leaves itself open for a sequel, but it's one of those endings where it's just as conclusive enough to end it. Snatcher would get a spiritual successor in the form of Policenauts, which traded the Blade Runner influences for something more closely resembling Lethal Weapon. In space. However, despite being on the much more successful PlayStation platform, this game never saw an official localization, most likely in due part to the obscene amounts of text and voice acting that would have to be localized. A number of years ago though, an official fan localization was released, a feat that is by no means a small one. It's a pretty amazing piece of work, really. Also, I imagine the eagle-eyed viewers probably caught on to the implications of the Kojima and Suda51 comparisons, as Snatcher would eventually get a radio drama prequel written by Suda himself called Snatcher, which delves into the story of Gene Gibson, one of the game's side characters. Overall, not much that has happened with this particular series aside from quite a few odd nods in the Metal Gear Solid series, but this game definitely stands as a standout experience in the visual novel and adventure genre. And if you got an empty evening ahead of you when you just want to put down time on something cool, suspenseful, and casual, there's few games as fitting to fulfill that purpose in a more satisfying way than Snatcher. music kicks ass too.